For 3 days, the four Gospels go completely silent. On Friday, the body of Jesus is taken down from the cross and sealed inside a borrowed tomb. On Sunday, the stone is rolled away, and the tomb is empty. And between those two moments, there is a gap, a silence. 3 days where the canonical Gospels say nothing at all about where he was or what he was doing. Matthew says nothing. Mark says nothing. Luke says nothing. John says nothing. The most important 72 hours in the history of the world, and the official record simply leaves them blank. But there is a tradition that does not leave them blank. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which guards the oldest and most complete body of sacred writing in all of Christianity, preserved a full description of exactly what happened during those 3 days. And what it describes is so vast, so cosmic, so far beyond what the four Gospels were willing to put into writing, that the early church chose to leave it out of the version most of the world would ever read. This is the descent, and this is what it actually means. Start with something you have said out loud, probably hundreds of times, maybe without ever thinking about it. If you have ever recited the Apostles' Creed in a church service, you have spoken these words. He was crucified, dead, and buried. He descended into hell. The third day he rose again from the dead. Stop on that middle line. He descended. The creed that millions of Christians have recited every Sunday for more than 1,500 years states plainly that between his death and his resurrection, Jesus went somewhere. He descended into the realm of the dead. The creed treats it as a settled fact, a core teaching, something every believer is supposed to affirm. And yet if you open your Bible and try to find the story behind that one line, you will not find it. The Gospels never narrate it. They confess that he died, and they confess that he rose. But the journey in between, the descent itself, appears nowhere in the four canonical accounts. You are asked to believe it happened. You are never told what it was. The story was removed from the place where most people would look for it, but it was not destroyed. It survived. It survived in the east, in the mountains of Ethiopia, in a canon the Western Church never fully adopted. And before you assume this is some late invention, some legend bolted on centuries afterward, look at what the canonical New Testament itself lets slip. Because the four Gospels go silent but the letters do not, they leak. The first letter of Peter, chapter 3, says something that has unsettled translators for 2,000 years. It says that Christ was put to death in the flesh but made alive in the Spirit, and that in the Spirit he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who long ago were disobedient in the days of Noah. Read that again slowly. After his death, before his resurrection, he went and preached to spirits held in a prison. The same letter, one chapter later, says that the gospel was preached even to those who are dead. Peter is describing a journey to the dead, a proclamation made in the place where the dead are held. The Gospels left it blank, but Peter could not help mentioning it because the early church knew it had happened. And notice how Peter says it. He drops the line almost in passing and hurries on, the way a person mentions something everyone in the room already knows. That is the tell. Peter is not teaching the descent to his readers. He is reminding them of it. Because in the earliest decades of the church, before the canon was trimmed, the descent was common knowledge. It was taught. It was confessed. It was part of the story every believer carried. Peter could mention it in half a sentence precisely because nobody needed it explained. Paul does the same thing. In the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, Paul writes that when it says he ascended, what does it mean except that he also descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is the very one who ascended far above all the heavens. Paul speaks of a descent into the lower parts of the earth as something his readers already understand, the story the Gospels do not tell. And then there is the strangest passage of all, hidden in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 27. At the moment Jesus dies, Matthew records that the earth shook, the rocks split, the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. They came out of the tombs after his resurrection and appeared to many in the holy city. The dead came out of their graves. The ancient saints walked the streets of Jerusalem. Matthew states it in a single sentence and then never mentions it again. He records the most extraordinary event imaginable, the dead rising and walking, and he gives it one line and moves on, as if he were describing the aftermath of something he was not allowed to describe directly. The breadcrumbs are everywhere in the canon, but the full meal is served only in the East. And here is a detail most Western Christians have never been told. The Bible that sits on the shelf in most homes, the Bible read in most churches across Europe and the Americas, contains 66 books. That number feels permanent, settled, almost sacred in itself. But that number is a choice. It is the result of councils and arguments and decisions made over centuries about what to keep and what to set aside. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon never made the same cuts. Their Bible holds 81 books, 15 more than the version most of the world reads. And those extra books are not filler. They are some of the oldest and most explosive writings in the entire biblical world. Books the Western Church read, debated, and then deliberately let fall away. When you understand that the Bible you grew up with is the trimmed version, the edited version, the version that decided certain accounts were too much, then the silence in the four Gospels stops looking like an accident. It starts looking like a decision. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church guards a biblical tradition older than almost any other on earth. When the rest of Christianity was still arguing about which books belonged in the Bible, Ethiopia had already received the faith, already translated the scriptures into the ancient language of Ge'ez, and already preserved a wider canon than anyone else would keep. Their Bible holds the Book of Enoch, which the Western Church discarded. It holds the Book of Jubilees. It holds books of Maccabean that no other tradition possesses. And alongside its Bible, it preserved the writings that describe the descent, the narrative the West pushed to the margins, carried in the latter part of the ancient work known as the Gospel of Nicodemus. This is the text that fills the 3-day silence. This is the account that tells you what the creed only summarizes in 4 words. He descended into hell. The Ethiopian tradition does not summarize it. It shows it to you. And once you see it, you understand why the men assembling the Western canon decided it was safer to leave the description out and keep only the single line of the creed. Here is what the descent actually describes. To understand it, you have to understand what the ancient world believed about the dead. Before the resurrection of Christ, according to this tradition, the gates of heaven were closed. Not one human soul had ever entered the presence of God. Not Adam, not Abraham, not Moses, not David, not Isaiah. Every righteous soul who had ever died, every prophet and patriarch and faithful believer from the beginning of the world, was held in a vast underground realm, a place of waiting, a place of shadow. The Hebrews called it Sheol, the Greeks called it Hades. It was not a place of fire and torment for these souls, it was something almost worse. It was a place of absence, a holding chamber where the righteous dead waited in the dark, separated from God for thousands of years with no way out and no knowledge of when or whether rescue would ever come. Adam had been waiting there since the beginning. Imagine that. The first man who had walked with God in the garden, who had heard the voice of his Creator in the cool of the day, had been sitting in that darkness for the entire span of human history, waiting. Abraham was there. Moses was there. Every soul that had ever trusted God and died was there in the waiting place behind gates that no one had ever opened from the inside. Try to feel the weight of that waiting because the tradition wants you to feel it. Adam had walked with God in the cool of the garden. He had heard the actual voice of his Creator, had been formed by the hands of God out of the dust of the earth, had been given a paradise and a companion and the breath of life directly from the source of all life. And then he had lost it, and then he had died, and then he had gone down into the dark, and there he had stayed, not for a year, not for a century, but for the entire unrolling length of human history. He watched his own son Abel arrive, the first human ever to die, murdered by his brother. And after Abel, generation after generation of his children came down into the same darkness to wait beside him. Every great figure of Scripture sat in the dark with Adam. Not one of them could open the gate. Not one of them knew if the rescue would ever come. They had only the promise, the ancient promise spoken in the garden at the very beginning, that one day the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. For thousands of years that promise was all they had, a sentence in the dark, and they held on to it across the entire span of time, waiting for the day it would finally be kept. And then, on that Friday, something changed. The descent tradition describes a strange light beginning to grow in the depths of that realm. The patriarchs, who had sat in shadow for ages, began to notice a brightness they had never seen. Adam turned to his sons. Abraham looked up, and one figure among them stepped forward to explain, because he had only just arrived. John the Baptist, the forerunner, the one who had been beheaded by Herod only a short time before. John had died ahead of Jesus, and the tradition says he descended into the realm of the dead the same way he had lived on earth, as the herald, the one who runs ahead to announce what is coming. And now, in the darkness, John spoke to the assembled dead exactly as he had spoken to the crowds at the Jordan River. He told them that the one he had baptized, the one whose sandal he was not worthy to untie, was coming, that the Messiah himself, was descending into the realm of the dead, that the rescue they had waited thousands of years to see was about to arrive. The waiting was ending. The light at the edge of the dark was him. Now the scene shifts, and this is where the Ethiopian description becomes something the four Gospels could never have contained, because the tradition does not only show you the righteous dead, waiting in hope, it takes you down further, into the lower chamber, into the throne room of death itself. And there it stages a conversation between two powers who rule the kingdom of the dead. One of them is Hades, the personification of the realm itself, the keeper of the prison, the one who has swallowed every soul since the beginning of time. The other is the adversary, the accuser, the power who had engineered the death of Jesus and was congratulating himself on his greatest victory. The accuser comes to Hades in triumph, and you have to understand the pride of this moment to feel how badly it is about to collapse. For 3 years, the accuser had watched this Galilean preacher undo his work everywhere he went. Every time the man spoke, prisoners of darkness were set free. The blind saw, the lame walked, the demon-possessed were cleansed, the dead were called back. Everywhere the preacher went, the kingdom of death lost ground, and the accuser had finally found a way to stop him, working through betrayal and through frightened men and through a Roman cross, until at last, the troublesome preacher hung dead in the afternoon sun. The accuser believed he had won the longest war in creation. He boasts that he has finally destroyed the troublesome preacher from Galilee, that the one who raised Lazarus and healed the blind and emptied so many graves has himself been nailed to a cross and is now dead and descending into their kingdom. He tells Hades to make ready, to prepare the strongest chains, because the most dangerous soul who ever lived is about to be delivered into their hands forever. But Hades is not celebrating. Hades is terrified. And the tradition gives Hades a speech that is one of the most chilling passages in all of early Christian literature. Hades turns to the accuser and asks him a question. Who is this that is coming? Because Hades remembers. Hades remembers a voice that recently shouted into his kingdom and tore a man named Lazarus right out of his grip after 4 days in the tomb. Hades remembers the power that called, and the dead obeyed. And Hades begins to understand what the accuser in his pride has failed to see. The one descending toward them is not a prisoner. He is not a victim. He is not another soul to be swallowed. He is the living God, wearing the death of a man like a key, descending into the deepest prison in creation for one reason, to break it open from the inside. Hades screams at the accuser, "You have brought him here. You thought you were defeating him, and instead you have carried the one being in existence who can destroy us straight through our own gates. Shut them, bar them, reinforce them." And the powers of death rush to seal the great bronze gates of the underworld against the approaching light. Sit with what Hades is actually saying, because it is the hinge of the entire account. Hades has swallowed billions of dead men and never trembled once. So why is the keeper of death suddenly terrified now? Because Hades has felt this exact power before, and the memory still burns. Think back to the village of Bethany. A man named Lazarus had died, not nearly died, not fallen into a coma. He had been dead 4 full days, long enough that his own sister warned that the body would already stink of decay. He was sealed in a tomb, wrapped in grave cloth, fully and completely claimed by the kingdom of death. Lazarus belonged to Hades. He was inside the prison, behind the gates, accounted for. And then a voice from the world of the living reached down through the gates and spoke 4 words. "Lazarus, come forth." And the dead man stood up. The decay reversed. The lungs filled, the heart beat, and Lazarus walked out of the tomb still wrapped in his burial cloth, torn out of the grip of death by a single sentence. Hades had never forgotten that voice. Hades had never recovered from that theft. And now that same voice was descending, not from the world above, but straight down into the kingdom itself, walking toward the throne room of death with the wounds of a cross still fresh and the authority of God still blazing. The accuser thought he had won. Hades knew the truth. They had not captured the most dangerous being in existence. They had invited him inside and locked the door behind him. And then comes the moment. The tradition draws directly from an ancient psalm here, a psalm that Jewish worshippers had sung for centuries without fully understanding what it described. The 24th Psalm, a psalm that cries out, "Lift up your heads, O you gates, and be lifted up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in." For generations, people had sung those words and assumed they were about the temple, about the gates of Jerusalem. The descent tradition reveals their true meaning. They were never about an earthly temple. They were the command spoken at the gates of the kingdom of death, the voice of Christ outside the bronze doors, demanding entry. "Lift up your heads, O you gates." And from inside, the terrified powers of death shout back the next line of the psalm as a question, trembling, "Who is this King of glory?" And the answer thunders back through the doors, "The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. He is not asking permission. He is announcing a conquest. Picture the powers of death in that instant. They had built their kingdom on one unbreakable rule. Whatever came down never went back up. The gates only opened inward. Every soul that crossed the threshold stayed. There were no exceptions in the entire history of the world. Kings and beggars, prophets and murderers, the righteous and the wicked, all of them came down, and none of them left. The kingdom of death was the one certainty in all of creation, the one door that never swung the other way. And now a voice stood outside that door and ordered it to open from the wrong side. Not begging, not bargaining, commanding. The everlasting doors that had never yielded to anything were being told to lift themselves up. And the keepers of the prison threw their full weight against the bronze, bracing it, barring it, piling every power they had against the doors, because they understood that if those gates opened even once, the rule that held their entire kingdom together would be broken forever, and nothing they held would ever be safe again. The gates do not hold. The tradition describes the bronze doors of the underworld, the doors that had held every human soul since the dawn of time, that no power in heaven or earth had ever opened, shattering inward like they were made of clay. Light pours into a darkness that had never known light, and the righteous dead, who had waited thousands of years in the shadow, see standing in the broken gateway the figure of a man wrapped in unbearable brightness, the wounds still visible in his hands and his feet, the marks of the very death that had given him the key to their prison. And he walks into the realm of the dead not as one of them, but as their conqueror and their rescuer. The tradition says he goes first to Adam. Of course he goes first to Adam. Think about why it has to be Adam. Everything that went wrong in the entire human story began with one reaching hand in a garden. Adam reached out and took the fruit that was forbidden, and in that single motion the door of death was opened, and every human being who would ever live was placed under its shadow. The whole long tragedy of the waiting place, the thousands of years of the righteous dead sitting in the dark, all of it flowed from that one hand closing around that one piece of fruit. And so when the rescue finally comes, the tradition makes the symmetry exact. The catastrophe began with the hand of the first man reaching for what would kill him, and the rescue begins with the hand of God reaching for the first man to undo it. And Christ reaches down and takes Adam by the hand. The same hand that had reached for forbidden fruit in the garden is now grasped by the hand of God, and the chains that had bound the first man since the beginning of time fall away. And then Eve, and then Abel, the first to ever die, murdered by his brother, and then Noah and Abraham and Moses and David and Isaiah, and every prophet and patriarch and righteous soul who had ever waited in that darkness, all of them lifted, all of them freed, all of them following the light up and out of the kingdom of death that could no longer hold them. The prison was not merely visited, it was emptied. The waiting place was broken open and abandoned, its gates hanging shattered, its keeper defeated, its long captivity ended forever. This is what the line in the creed actually means. He descended into hell, not as a defeated man, not as a captive of death. He descended as the living God who used his own death as the instrument to break open the oldest prison in creation and lead out every soul that had ever waited there in hope. The descent was not a detour on the way to the resurrection. The descent was the rescue mission that the entire incarnation had been building toward. He did not merely come to die. He came to die so that he could enter the kingdom of the dead with full authority and tear its gates off their hinges from the inside. And this is the reason Matthew could write that single haunting sentence about the tombs of the saints opening and the dead walking out into Jerusalem. Because at the moment the descent reached its climax below, the graves above could not stay shut. Death itself had been broken at the root, and the breaking was felt in both worlds at once. So why is it not in the four Gospels? Why did the canon that most of the world reads leave out the most cosmic event in the entire story of salvation? There are several answers, and each one tells you something. The first is simply that the Gospel writers were recording the testimony of eyewitnesses, and no living eyewitness had followed Jesus into the realm of the dead. They could write what they had seen, the crucifixion they had seen, the empty tomb they had seen, the risen Christ eating fish on the shore they had seen. But the descent happened in a place no living person could observe, and so it sat outside the boundary of eyewitness testimony, in the realm of what was confessed and believed, rather than what was watched and reported. The second answer is harder. As the Western Church organized its canon, it grew cautious about texts that described the unseen world in vivid detail. The descent narrative, with its conversation between Hades and the accuser, its shattered bronze gates, its dialogue and drama, read more like an unveiling than a report, and the men shaping the canon preferred the restraint of a single creedal line to the overwhelming scope of the full account. They kept the confession and set aside the description. He descended into hell. 4 words allowed to stand in for a story too vast to safely contain. There is something almost miraculous in how this account survived at all. When a story is cut from the main canon of a religion, it usually dies. It loses its readers, loses its copyists, loses the institutions that keep it alive, and within a few generations it crumbles into dust and is forgotten entirely. That is what happened to countless early writings. They were set aside, and then they were lost. But the descent did not vanish, because of an accident of geography and faith. Far to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia, sat a church that had received Christianity in the earliest centuries, long before most of Europe, and had translated the scriptures into Ge'ez, an ancient sacred language that the rest of the Christian world did not read and largely could not even recognize. That church was high in the mountains, protected by distance and altitude, and it did not answer to the councils that were trimming the Western canon. It kept what it had received. It guarded the wider collection of books behind monastery walls, copied by hand across the centuries by monks who never knew that the rest of the world had let these very texts fall away. And so a story that the West had quietly retired survived in full, in a language few outsiders could read, in a place few outsiders could reach, waiting like the patriarchs themselves for the day it would be brought back into the light. But Ethiopia kept the story. The mountain church that had received the faith early and guarded it fiercely never trimmed its canon down to match the West. It held the wider collection. It preserved the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees inside its Bible, and alongside them, in the wider body of sacred writing it guarded in Ge'ez, it carried the account of the descent through 15 centuries, while the rest of Christianity forgot it existed. And so today, if you want to read what Jesus did during the 3 days the 4 Gospels leave blank, you do not look in the version printed in most of the world. You look east. You look to the sacred tradition the mountain church of Ethiopia guarded for 15 centuries, the one that never threw the description away. The descent is not a heretical legend. It is the missing chapter. It is the answer to the silence. It is the reason the Creed can confess in 4 words what the Gospels could not narrate in 4 books. He descended into hell, and he came back up the stairs of the broken prison, leading the entire human family of the faithful out behind him, into the light. There is one more thing the descent tradition reveals, and it changes how you read the resurrection itself. We tend to think of Easter Sunday as the moment of victory, the empty tomb, as the proof that death was beaten. But the descent tells you that the real battle, the actual breaking of death, did not happen at the tomb on Sunday morning. It happened below, in the dark, on the silent Saturday that the world calls Holy Saturday, while the disciples hid in grief, convinced that everything was lost, convinced that their teacher was dead and their hope was buried. The truth was the exact opposite of what it appeared. At the very hour they believed death had won, death was being torn apart from the inside. The quietest day in the Christian calendar, the day when nothing seems to be happening, the day of the sealed tomb and the scattered followers, was in fact the loudest day in the history of the cosmos. The day the gates of the kingdom of death were shattered and emptied. The resurrection on Sunday was not the start of the victory. It was the announcement of a victory that had already been won in the deep on Saturday. The empty tomb was simply the conqueror returning to the surface to show his face after the real war had already ended below. Think about what that does to the day the disciples lived through. That Saturday was the worst day of their lives. Their teacher was a corpse in a sealed tomb behind a Roman guard, and every hope they had carried for 3 years was buried with him. They hid in locked rooms, afraid they would be next, grieving a future that had collapsed. And they were grieving at the exact moment of the greatest victory in the history of creation. They thought God had abandoned them. He had simply gone lower than they could see, into the deepest place there is, to finish the rescue that had begun in a manger. And the tradition holds that up to you like a mirror, because you have your own silent Saturdays, your own days when it looks like nothing is happening, and every hope is sealed in a tomb. It is telling you that the silence is not always what it appears to be. This is why the tradition treats the descent as too powerful to contain in a single confession. It does not merely add a scene to the story, it relocates the climax. It tells you that the most decisive moment in the salvation of the human race took place in a location no camera could reach, in a silence no gospel recorded, on a day the world remembers as empty. And it tells you that if you had been standing in that darkness, among the patriarchs, among the waiting dead, you would have seen the impossible. You would have seen the gates that held you for ages explode inward. You would have seen the light flood a place that had never known it. And you would have seen a wounded man walk in and call your name, and reach down his scarred hand to lift you out. That is the descent. That is what the Ethiopian Bible preserved while the rest of the world kept only 4 words of it. And it raises a question that the next part of this story has to answer. Because if the gates of the kingdom of death were truly shattered on that Saturday, and the prison of the righteous dead was truly emptied, then there is one figure the tradition has not yet accounted for. One name that the descent narrative circles around, but never lets you fully see. The keeper of the gates. The power that ruled that realm before the descent broke it open. What happened to him when the light came in? And what the Ethiopian writings say about where he is now is the part of this account that the Western Church was most determined to bury. If this opened your eyes to the chapter the Gospels left blank, type the word descent in the comments below. Subscribe to the Buried Testament, because the rest of this story has been waiting in the dark just as long. The next part is coming.